Hi everyone, in today's video I wanted to show you how I painted this beautiful bouquet of watercolor flowers wrapped in brown paper. This video is sped up just a little bit because it took about an hour to paint this, and I think a lot of the process is slow and repetitive, so we'll be able to talk about it really well, and I think you'll get an entire picture of how it works. For the sketch, I don't have a picture of it, but I used reference photos that I saw online of what I liked in paper wraps and ribbons, and then I left the center open instead of sketching the flowers because I wanted them to be really loose and in the moment. So I started by painting the entire brown paper with a light wash of brown that I mixed using my limited palette of colors. I used magenta and cad yellow with a little bit of green and blue that were on my palette. So my limited palette is cad yellow, quin magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green, and those are the only colors I will be using today. While my light brown color is still wet, I'm mixing magenta, cad yellow, and some of the sap green to get a slightly darker brown to tap in some shadow colors. So I'm thinking shadows are going to be mostly where the ribbon is bunching up this brown paper and also where some of the paper is layering on top of the other paper. So I'm just trying to focus some of that shadow color into those areas while it's still wet. And then I rinsed my brush, tapped it on a paper towel, and with a damp brush I lifted some of the highlight back out of the left side so we can focus more of the shadow color on the right side of the paper. As my paper starts to dry and is more damp than wet, I can place some of this darker brown pigment still into those shadow areas. So I like to continue to place some of these darker pigments kind of in layers as my painting dries and becomes less and less wet. So we're going to leave the paper to dry for now because we do want to add more layers, but they need to be not wet into wet. So we're going to paint our flowers. I am painting daisies as the main flower. I'm going to paint 3 of them. I start by painting a bright cad yellow center, and then I picked up a really light wash of a blue mixture that was already on my palette, but it needs to be really watery and really light because we're painting a white flower that isn't white. We can't paint it white because we're not using white paint and it's white paper, so we have to use kind of the yellow from the center of the flower and this bluish watery paint to give us all the colors within our flower petals. So if the center of our flower is concentrated enough and not too watery, we should be able to tap into that center just a little bit with our bluish watery wash, and then it almost creates these petals that are very light and blue, have a little bit of yellow diffused in them, and maybe even some green as the blue and the yellow mix together. So it's just a very beautiful way to create these really light white quote unquote flowers without using any white paint. So I'm doing one that's kind of, you can see most of the center, and one that you can definitely see most of the center, and then one where you're seeing from the side. While the petals and the centers are still wet, I can continue to manipulate them and add more paint, like some more yellow to the centers and a little bit more blue to the petals so that everything blends really nicely, and then we need to let those dry as well. Now I thought the perfect complement to these white daisies would be lavender. So I'm mixing magenta with cerulean, maybe a tiny bit of indigo for depth, and I like to think of painting the simple lavender as almost like little heart shapes that start bigger and then continuously get smaller and smaller and less heart shapey looking as they get towards the top. But I just think the more textural and loose you can be with these flowers, the better, because the daisies are so precise and almost more detailed and exact. These can be very textural and loose, and we're just kind of placing them randomly, thinking about how a bunch of flowers would be grouped together, how they would be sticking out around the daisies, and you still want to remember to leave room for the greenery. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to add in some of the greenery. You need to start with a lighter, brighter green first so that we can layer some of our darker green colors on top later. I think adding greenery to a bouquet can be really tricky because our brain wants us to add leaves. But when flowers and leaves and greenery are all bunched together, everything is kind of tucked in together. So most of the time we're not going to be seeing a full whole leaf. And if you paint one like that, it might look really weird in the middle of the bouquet. So remember the idea of implied lines and implied shapes. Not everything has to connect to a line, and not every shape has to be an exact leaf. Just the idea of green in a shape around a flower is going to make our brains think that it's a leaf. So we're just kind of creating these shapes, leaving enough white space for gaps and interest, and we can create more leafy shapes as we get farther out into the edges of the bouquet where they would be sticking out. But I think the daisies are so big, we don't want to do any leaves that kind of compete with them, so we're going to keep most of our leaves very small. I've added indigo into my green mixture because I think a cool blue-green is perfect for lavender, so I'm adding the stems to connect all of the lavender flower bunches, and then I'm using this blue-green color to add dimension and shadows and contrast throughout the entire bouquet in the bright green areas as well. And I think the contrast between the bright green and the cool blue is so beautiful and gives a lot of texture and interest to the entire bouquet. And this is one of those reasons why I say to trust the process with watercolor, because watercolor is a layering medium. Sometimes we put down a base color that's really a blob and shapeless, but we don't have to be too detailed in our first base layers because we can build upon them and layer and add depth later. So definitely don't freak out in the ugly stages of watercolor. Now I'm using that same yellow-green and blue-green to create stems coming out of the bottom of the paper. And I wish that I hadn't made it quite so thick towards the paper line and kept them a little bit more separated, but I am trying to create the look of the stems coming out towards the bottom and having them come out at random angles and at different lengths to look more organic. Something that's really going to help our daisies pop, since they are white and they are starting to disappear in the white space that we're leaving in our bouquet, is creating greenery and dark shadows around the petals a little bit more distinctly than we have before. So this technique is called negative painting, where we paint around an object to have that object show up. So we can paint little bits of that greenery around the petals, and then they just become more and more defined. The centers of our daisies dried, so I add a little bit of yellow-orange to the left side of the centers just to give it some dimension and texture on that side. Now to the paper, the brown paper, because the flowers are mostly done, but the way that this looks good, this entire painting, is if we get the paper texture and the wrinkles in the crevices of the folds of this brown paper wrap to look right. So I am using magenta to create that brownish color with cad yellow, and then I started to use indigo, and you can see it just looks too black. I don't like that. I really like using complementary colors to create the shadows, so I should have used sap green, and I'm realizing it at this point that it's not my favorite. So this is me figuring it out and moving color around to create texture and shadow and interest on the brown paper. I am layering, 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 and focusing most of this deeper brown color that I'm using with magenta into those shadow areas where the paper is layered on top of itself, where it's got this big crease fold in the center and then some folds on the sides where that ribbon is kind of cinching that brown paper in. And I really want the entire piece of paper that's wrapped around the bouquet to have some slight texture. So I'm trying to figure that as I go. But I think the trick is to remember that you can always layer and that you should use complementary colors to make another color deeper. I should have used green to make my magenta deeper instead of the indigo. But it gets resolved in the end. It's just a lesson in trusting the process, and that at least as long as your paper is still wet and your paint is kind of wet, you can kind of move things around as much as you want. You can tap things out with a paper towel. You can use your brush to kind of rinse it out, tap it on your paper towel, and lift colors out. So I am just kind of playing around with this paper, trying to figure out the best way to get texture and shadow and have it look normal and natural. So don't be afraid to play around with it. Look at your reference photo. I had probably 10 reference photos from Google on my computer, and I was looking at them trying to figure out how to get the deep color of the shadow and diffuse the color as it comes out of the fold, and then leave that highlighted side of the paper so that it looks folded. So anyway, we're going to come back to the paper while it dries. I need to let it dry so I can add more of those details, and we're going to put some details onto the flowers. I did a dark detail on the center now that that has dried, just around just a little bit, and then I created a deeper purple blue just to add a slight touch to the lavender and give it a lot of dimension. Sometimes simple flowers can be really flat, so if you can take the same color you painted it with, then wait for it to dry and add it later as a layered contrasting detail, it really makes those flowers pop. Okay, now that the paper on our wrap has dried more, we can start adding details without them blending out so much, and we can hopefully start defining where more of this shadow is, especially in these main wrinkles on the front. So I'm really trying to use magenta as much as I can, adding in some indigo and sap green a little bit to get that darker color, but I'm still just trying to layer and blend and figure out where those shadows are and how I can make them look like a wrinkle in the paper. So this is, a trial and error for all of us. I'm not painting paper wrinkles often in my practice, so it's not that I haven't painted it before, but it is something that is just, it's hard. It's hard to capture. I think the most important thing that I did to create the look of this paper wrinkled like this is maintaining and keeping the highlighted areas. So try to focus your shadows in direct spots, layering and building and blending out when you need to. And then if you're maintaining the highlights, it should start appearing, because the highlights are what is hard to bring back, and we can't see distinct shadows if we don't have a highlighted area to compare it to. It's not going to look like a very severe wrinkle in the paper if right next to that shadow is not very bright and highlighted. So we got to keep the highlight, but we also need medium values of color, which is not light and not super dark. And I feel like I have built up all of these medium values. And now as my paper is drying, I'm starting to add the final details in these darker values, and slowly crawling my way, this paper is starting to come to life. There's an extra added surprise that I do soon, that I feel like takes the paper and the painting in general to a whole new level. But it's almost like magic, where you can see that these wrinkles have appeared somehow magically through all the layers and all of the movement and all of the finicky fiddling. And it's because if you keep your highlights, you build up some of those medium values, and you trust the process and know that there are lots of ugly stages, and then you just punch in those really high contrast areas for shadows, then it just looks so visually appealing and exactly how you pictured it, and it starts to come together. Now I am adding a very light blue wash around the daisy petals, but just mostly around the centers to finish those off. Before we finish the texture on the paper, we're going to finally paint our bow. I am starting with a base color of light blue so that it's not white and we have a color to work with. So this is my trick. You can use an X-Acto knife. I am using a small kiridashi knife that my husband made for me. He's a blacksmith. And you use this knife very gently to scratch off very lightly some of the surface of the paper. And you can see how much highlight this has brought into the painting, but also it gives the paper this interesting texture that almost makes it feel like you could reach out and you could feel that paper. And I not only love that it gives it that interesting texture, but some of the areas where I got too carried away with maybe some of the shadows or I lost some of the highlight, I can just kind of scratch it in a little bit. So it's doing a couple of things. It's creating interest, creating texture, it's bringing back some of my highlight, which is really hard to do, and you can just kind of scratch the surface of your watercolor paper, use a little eraser to help remove some of it, and look how cool that looks. I was really happy because I wasn't 100% feeling the paper until I did this technique, and I feel like it drastically changed everything about it. Isn't it cool how a highlight can do that? And we still didn't have to use white paint. That's my favorite part. And then in some of the areas, so that it's not a stark white contrast, you can add a light layer of yellowish brown to really tie it all in. Okay, let's finish the bow. I thought a really nice pinstripe would be perfect. The trick with doing stripes is you really need to follow the lines. So my bow lines are very curved. I have to follow those lines and make sure that they're coming down into a taper where they are knotted, because that's how a ribbon would come down together and the lines would almost disappear as they're joining into that knot. Now I do end up adding stripes for the inside of the ribbon, which is kind of cool, but there's not a lot of definition and detail in the ribbon, so don't bother with this step. I end up doing a shadow to help very distinctly define where the top of the ribbon is and the inside of the ribbon is. Now I am just using some darker bluish green to really help finish off the details in the greenery, just to add one last contrast and final pop to make sure everything looks grounded and solid, especially down in the stems. They needed a little bit more contrast and definition. But again, watercolor is a layering medium. We want to layer, we need to wait for it to dry, and then we can add these details that really finish the piece off and make it look like we thought it out well and that it's completely finished. Now I am going to add the shadow color. I'm using a bluish magenta. I really wanted it to be dark, but not so dark that we couldn't add shadow into the shadow area. So I'm just making sure that the inside is defined, that there's some wrinkles in the knot that's defined, and then I added a little bit more magenta to that mixture and just tapped that into some of that inside ribbon to create more of a depth of shadow. And then I start using deeper magentas, deeper purpley blue colors, just to tap in and finish off these shadow lines, just to make sure that they are really crisp and really dark. Watercolor dries lighter than you think it will, and so sometimes after you've painted something that you really like and you see that it has dried, it will look really flat, and so you can just add another layer of that color just to make sure it really pops. And then I just thought it'd be fun to bring some more color to the paper. I did a very light wash of yellow in some areas of the paper, but I think it really looks so cool and transform it, almost looks a little reflective and brings some of the vibrance and the color back to the paper so it's not just shadowed and magenta. Thank you so much for being here today while we painted this beautiful bouquet of flowers wrapped in paper. I had so much fun with this one, and I hope you learned a lot, even with this more speedy style where I was talking over it. Please let me know if you like that in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye.